welcome to today's video webinar, taking the first step toward a critical evolution of pharma's commercial model, brought to you by ZS Associates and hosted by Biopharma Dive. My name is Laura Beth Ezel from Biopharma Dive Studio ID, and we are thrilled that you're joining us today. Now, we'll meet our guests in just a minute, but before we begin, we want to cover a few housekeeping items. Our format today is an industry expert panel discussion with 10 minutes allocated for a Q&A at the end. Now, at the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. Now, we do encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget. And we will try to answer your questions during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. Please know that we do capture all questions. Following the presentation, you will also be able to access the on-demand recording of the webinar using the same link from today's live event. Now, let me introduce you to today's speakers. Michael Townsend is a research manager for IDC Health Insights, responsible for commercial life sciences and life sciences commercial strategies. His research expertise includes sales and marketing, supply chain, manufacturing systems, emerging technologies, and market trends. Also with us today are four principals from ZS. Tom Nishay has 20 years of consulting experience focused on pharmaceutical sales and marketing. He currently heads ZS's innovation work streams to redefine the sales performance management for an ever-changing healthcare landscape. Maria Kliachko is the product lead for ZS's intelligent commercial execution software, Verso. She also leads the integrated analytics advisory area, helping life sciences clients establish and advance their analytics capabilities. J.F. Latour leads ZS's overall sales compensation practice area. He has been working on sales compensation related issues for more than 18 years and has specific experience in compensation design, administration, operations, and program management. And finally, Pratap Hedkar, who has been the managing principal for ZS's global pharmaceuticals practice since 2012. Pratap advises leading pharma companies on a wide range of sales and marketing challenges, focusing on effective strategies and analytics in the new healthcare ecosystem. So we are so glad to have our panel here today, and Tom is going to handle the panel discussion. So I'll hand it over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks to all the participants who are joining us today. I'm really excited today to spend the next 60 minutes or so with our panel of experts. As we close 2020, which has brought about so much change in our healthcare landscape, we felt that it was a great time to ask some of the industry's top commercial operations experts what their analysis of the change is and what their outlook for the future is. In particular, we felt it'd be great to hear from our experts what future changes to the pharma commercial model they expect to see in reaction to the shock to the system that pharma has experienced. Pharma has been operating under pretty much the same commercial model for the last 20 to 30 years. There's been some evolution, of course, but there's also been great consistency in how pharma has done resource planning, alignment, incentives, and field execution. So the question now is this about to change? Was 2020 such a shock to the system? Was the disruption that we've undergone so massive that it will trigger a series of structural changes in how commercial pharma operates? Or will we return once this is over, and we hope this is over soon, will we return to the way we've operated in the past 20 to 30 years? So this is probably a good place to bring in our panel. And Pratap, I'll start with you for the first question. Why do you believe organizations should change now? Why is now an important time for pharma to finally change its commercial model?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for the question. So I tend to look at it as 2 or 3 factors. One is, like you pointed out, there was a great shock to the system, and we're still going through it, of course. In fact, the third week of March, if I take pharma's investment, pharma spends about $15 billion a year on sales forces. All of that activity vanished in a week. It was gone. 90 to 95% of that activity was gone. Now it's coming back slowly, but if I look at in-person calling activity, which is kind of the mainstay, among other things, of pharma's commercial model, it's back to maybe about 15%, 20% of pre-COVID levels. So pharma was forced to reevaluate what it actually had because it went away almost overnight. The second piece is that when we come out of this next year, the new normal will look different. It's altered our customers' habits. In fact, when we do pulses, a third of physicians say to us, coming back, I would be pretty comfortable with virtual interactions with sales reps, digital interactions with pharma companies, much more so than before. Before it was a nice to have, now it will become a must-have capability, among other things. And the third piece, I was talking to the CFO of Novo Nordisk. We were interviewing them for their experience. And one of the things that they have done, of course, they've also changed their commercial model, but he said one thing that stuck with me. He said, the best time to fix the roof is when the sun is out, not when it's pouring rain. And in some sense, pharma has weathered this storm reasonably well in terms of sales impact. And so I think it's a really good time to consider a change before your back is to the wall and you have to change. And I think some of the more progressive organizations are doing just that.
Thanks, Pratap. Michael, how do you see the market from your perspective? What are some of the key market trends that you've seen that pharma leaders need to pay special attention to?
Yeah, well, I think that even prior to COVID, prior to the pandemic, we were seeing a lot of trends occurring in terms of, a reduced number of doctors who were seeing field sales reps personally. There's been a lot of consolidation in provider groups and so on, and a lot of rules. My own family physician, it's funny, I was in there a couple months ago and I asked him, how often he sees sales reps, and he said, I don't get to see them at all anymore. It's a rule, and he's part of his group has been bought by a big hospital organization out here in Massachusetts. And he mentioned he actually misses free lunches and so on. But anyway, it's a trend that's been going on for quite a while. And of course, it was accelerated greatly by COVID. So, the same trend that was going prior to COVID is still going on, but it's been accelerated. And that is, much more reliance on digital channels. A lot of doctors have preference to use certain digital channels, and it's going to be important for pharmaceutical companies to kind of meet them where they are. Particularly younger doctors, much more comfortable with technology. They may prefer a message coming a certain way. They may be accessing web portals. They may be opening email. They may be attending webinars. And a lot of times they may not even be doing it during office hours. So everyone needs to adjust and be able to reach them where they are. And, I think the other trend that's occurring with this digitization of, transferring information to providers, there's also a trend for the effective organizations in actually less messages, but more impactful and more relevant messages. And doctors love it when that actually works out, because they're not being inundated with, 1,000 emails and actually perhaps messages coming even from different departments within the same company, within the same brand. So that kind of leads to another trend, and that's really, the orchestration and coordination of communication with providers from pharmaceutical companies. And what that's really going to require is breaking down a lot of the silos that exist in organizations now, particularly large ones. The people in marketing, the people in sales, the people in market access, the people in medical affairs, they all need to know what the other group is doing so that their messages are consistent, so that they're relevant, and that they're impactful. And so the breaking down of silos, I think, is something that's a trend and is going to keep going that way, and we're all going to be the better for it.
Absolutely. Maria Michael just mentioned how critical digital and orchestration are becoming, how even more critical they're becoming. You've been looking at digital and analytics very closely for quite some time as well. Have you seen examples of companies making moves in reaction to the changes in our environment? And are there common themes that are influencing these companies to act?
So yeah, absolutely, and I cannot agree more with Mike when he said that it's becoming more digital now and more orchestrated and less siloed. And just one additional fact, how right now the part of the customer journey that is happening over the digital channels is about 80%. It's a long journey, and we know that we're selling complex things that have to be taken with a lot of research, and a lot of this research happening online. A lot of the customer journey, whether it has to do with figuring out the diagnosis, figuring out the right prescription, figuring out the reimbursement, a lot of this journey is happening digitally, and we need to be able to drive our clients, whether it's patients or HCPs or administrators, through that journey. So the key here is that it's not just more messages over more channels about more stuff. It's really about orchestrating that very seamless journey, understanding where each customer is and what part of the information they need right now, and supplying it through the channel, through the way that they can best absorb it and make the next decision and make the next move. And so in order to do that, it really needs a lot of data, content, analytics, all coming together and figuring out who that customer is, what's the right time, what's the right message, what will work better. And that is a very complex problem that requires multiple departments, that requires analytics and IT and marketing and sales. And so what we're seeing from the companies who succeed at this, those are the companies who are able to look at their customer experience, to recognize maybe that it's not the right one today, but what would be the right one, detail the use cases, organize their whole organization, all the departments around those use cases, and provide a lot of clarity into what it means, what it needs to be built. And that really helps to break the silos and organize around this company goal, this customer experience that is really the most beneficial for the clients. So the laggards, however, the companies who are a little bit behind, they may have invested in some channels before, but they are not integrated, they are not organized, and we are seeing some of them coming to ask, how do we leapfrog now to the level where some of the front runners are? What do we need to invest? Where are the biggest gaps? And of course, it will require the same kind of vision and leadership alignment, organizational alignment, and all the different capabilities, from content to analytics to digital marketing operations, sales operations, dynamic targeting, all the pieces that help to drive the right message to the right customer at the right time.
Right. Jeff, you bring in a different perspective. Your focus is operations and IC. Can you share from your perspective examples of companies who have reacted more quickly and better to the marketplace disruptions that we've discussed? And for these companies, what are the factors that have made them more ready to act?
Great question, Tom. So there are a few factors that comes into play. I would say the first one has been the companies that have been at the leading edge in terms of innovation and willingness to try new things over the past few years. So it's not something that they had to react and it was the first time that they had to try a change. It's something that they have done over time. They've been comfortable to do change, to implement new things, to try new things, and being willing that what they're trying will not be perfect the first time. So that has been something really key. So you try something, it works, maybe not completely, and then you build upon it. So those companies have clearly reacted faster to some of the change. So that's one aspect from a strategic perspective. Then there is a component more from a technological perspective, which is the company that had good platform and good system, very well integrated, that allowed you to become much more nimble and make change rapidly. We're able to make the change and basically react within the situation, for example, with COVID. So if you take in sales compensation and incentive, there are companies that have been able to tweak their plan and adjust them appropriately as soon as we hit basically in March or in April, let's put it like that, for Q2, whereas others that were not as well equipped from a platform perspective or technology were not able to implement any of those changes. It took them much longer to get there. So those are some of the drivers that I've noticed in terms of, from an operation perspective, which were the companies that were able to move faster and react faster.
Michael, similar question. You are an acute observer of the industry. What are the factors that, in your opinion, make companies more willing to reinvent themselves in an uncertain environment? And do you have examples that you can share?
Well, I think probably the biggest factor is one of leadership, and this can come from a lot of different areas, but clearly the CIO needs to be involved, but generally the CIO isn't going to be as aware of what, for example, field salespeople need to be more effective, or what a marketing team needs to be more effective. So a lot of leadership needs to come from the line of business, from the business managers. And that's looking inside and outside the company. So the leaders really need to be aware of what's going on in other companies. They need to be talking to people outside the companies, as well as their own employees, for suggestions on, the employees want to be productive, they want to be effective. So there needs to be some sort of system in place where the folks responsible for making the decisions on technology can talk to the folks inside, but at the same time be aware of what some of the successes outside the company are. So, really, it's primarily a factor of leadership. And as one of my colleagues here mentioned earlier, that also includes being able to take risks and not being afraid to make mistakes, because things aren't going to work perfectly the first time. But the organizations need to be led into the future as far as technology goes.
That's a great point, Michael. In fact, another example, a public one, Genentech has also made a change to their commercial model. They started even before COVID, so it wasn't that they were focused specifically on this disruption, but it helped them. And like you said, Michael, again, top-down leadership passion, leadership commitment from the business side was key. But the other aspect, which JF also talked about, is, do you want to approach this thing as a pilot, or, as we like to call it, an early experience team? The difference is the pilot is all about, well, is this going to work? Whereas the early experience mindset is, of course, it's not going to be perfect, but I'm doing it so I can learn and adjust very quickly in the next and the next and the next iteration, the next location. So how do I have that mindset of continuous improvement as opposed to a yes or no decision after 6 months? So I think having that mindset, Tom, has also stood some companies in great stead. And Genentech implemented their model earlier this year. So there are some good examples of companies really being at the cutting edge.
Yeah, agreed.
We've talked about some of the conditions that are favorable to change. Let's switch gears now and talk about obstacles. And Jeff, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. What are some of the obstacles that you've seen in pharma companies that keeps them from initiating change?
It's a great question, Tom. So there is a variety of obstacles, and sometimes you see more than once in one company, and sometimes you see fewer. But I would start, the first one in my mind is really the alignment of leadership. and both Pratap and Michael and Maria have talked about it, without having the alignment at the leadership level, it will be impossible to achieve the change. Because you need a common vision, you need to have that cross-functional collaboration and expertise across the team to really achieve that change. So that's really the main one, I would say. Then the second one, you go from the more vision to a very operational or tactical perspective, which is a technology one. So having the technology and to enable you to make the change. So some companies, for example, if I look from an incentive compensation perspective, realize when COVID happened that you had different changes in different regions. And so the idea was maybe we should try to have different incentive plan across different region and be more local. Some companies were not able to do it because they didn't have the right infrastructure to do it, or it would take too much time to try to achieve that aspect of things. So technology there can be clearly an obstacle. And then the last one is that agility and nimbleness. I would say it's a combination of both technology, leadership, decision, vision, and so forth, but the willingness to go and make the change, understanding it may not be perfect the first time, and how fast can we do it. I'll give a good example again in COVID, in the world of incentive, was people wanted to really recognize the fact that potential had changed across the nation because different areas were affected by COVID at different time. And so companies had an ability forecasting method or a good insight about a month in advance and trying to see, we know a month in advance when will be the next epicenter and so forth. The challenge there was the system or the company itself or the organization was not nimble enough, because by the time you would have implemented, then your line of sight would have basically disappeared and you would have had to change your decision.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's move on to a new topic. What I'd like to understand now from our panelists is what their advice is for organizations who want to get started in this transformation journey, who want to change. And Pratap, I'll begin with you, and maybe let's take a step back and discuss the broader perspective. Looking at it holistically, what are the big gaps and improvements that commercial ops leaders should consider in reaction to the evolutions in the landscape?
Yeah. So I think there are probably 4 vectors of change. You don't have to change all 4 at the same time, but there are companies that are changing more than one. I'll give you the 4 examples. So the first vector is healthcare is absolutely more local. I mean, you see that in the maps every day when you open the newspaper. It's not just this crisis. Healthcare and the way it functions and the barriers and the gaps have become extremely local, whether it's states or cities or counties. And so one change is, can you shift to much more local, much more customized, much more heterogeneous go-to-market model? That's one change. The second is, well, part of the localness of healthcare is because these providers are consolidating, payers have local influence. So as we talk about these large institutions, they are becoming much more important to healthcare. It's not just this sort of uniform spreading of doctors and patients. You have to pay attention to large providers and payers as well. So how does pharma become better at business to business selling, not a business to an individual selling, which pharma has been very good at? The third change I think that pharma needs to consider is, as you look at the patient journey, I would say 90%, maybe more, of pharma's focus in terms of commercialization has been focused on the top half of the funnel, how to get to the script. What happens after that? 30 to 60% of value is lost after the script is written, after the rep has done their job. And so service roles are growing tremendously as pharma is realizing this. In fact, the growth in service roles is a factor of almost 3x compared to 3-4 years ago, whereas the sales roles have remained flat in terms of total investment. So you begin to see this shift that you're going from a sales mindset to a sales plus service mindset with all customer support roles. And then the fourth piece is more customers, more complex customers, more roles, lots of coordination needed. And this gets us back to the theme of orchestration. And Maria, I know you were already talking about this, but putting it all together in the right way becomes the important fourth vector of change.
Yeah, and I would just add to that in this orchestration Pratap mentioned, it's the orchestration of all the everything we're doing for the client, the customers, but it's also all we're doing across those three types of the customers, right? And it requires a lot of data, a lot of new data that we haven't had before, a lot of analytics. So what we're seeing that companies are going to this different mindset, data-driven mindset, analytics-driven mindset, the big brain that calculates all of that. I think that's another kind of big change that needs to happen, is more data and analytics driven mindset, without which we will not be able to make such a seamless collaboration between many different people and different channels in service of particular customers.
I really like this framework. I think the four vectors, I think it summarizes really nicely the new capabilities organizations need to consider and gives them options. But where should people start, Michael? Where do you think pharma should focus to get started on the journey towards evolving their commercial model?
Yeah, well, I think an important first step is really to for leadership teams to do their best to learn best practices on what's succeeded at other companies, and there's a lot of ways to try to find that out. Join associations where you have an opportunity to talk to your peers, to get on committees that are moving the framework for technology forward. There's a lot of ways to get free information on that. You can talk to software vendors. You can get, and they'll certainly share their success stories with you, and going deeper than that, talk to their references. They're usually happy to provide you customer references that you can have an independent talk with and learn some of the pitfalls, learn some of the the mistakes that they may have made. People are usually happy to talk about that. Same goes for service providers. Really what's important is that you pick partners who are experienced in whatever journey it is that you're taking within life sciences. It's a different industry than packaged goods or other discrete manufacturing or finance. You need to find people who have life science experience and have been through the regulatory issues, the privacy issues, and so on, who can really help point you in the right direction. Another item that I think that's really important, and I think one of the panelists mentioned infrastructure and platforms before. You really need to have a cloud strategy. A lot of this orchestration, the coordination, and so on, especially when you're consulting with many different sources for data, it really needs to be on the cloud. So having an actual cloud strategy to kind of set up the plumbing to be able to accomplish some of these things is really important.
And when you say cloud strategy, most companies have cloud initiatives. What
Sure.
do you mean? What's the difference between a cloud strategy and a cloud initiative?
Yeah, it's interesting. Earlier I guess it was this summer, IDC conducted a survey. It was a multi-industry survey. So, I primarily focused on the life science data because that's my world. It was interesting that about 2/3 of the respondents have already adopted a hybrid cloud strategy. So a combination of public cloud along with private cloud, and even on-premise that might be accessible through a private cloud. And the other third are planning to move to that model within the next 24 months, as of the middle of 2020. And then I looked at another issue related to our discussion here, and that's analytics software. And it turns out that for the respondents that we talked to anyway, Again, about 2/3 of them are already using their analytics software in the cloud. And there's another significant portion. It doesn't add up to 100% like the hybrid cloud, but it adds up to about 90% will be using their analytics software in the cloud within a couple of years. There was a small group of people who went to a public cloud and then pulled back to on-premise, believe it or not. It was only about 5%. And then there's some, you can call them dead enders or something, that it's 4 or 5% that said they're on-premise with their analytics and they're not even considering going to the cloud. But that's a small percentage. 90% are going to be using that stuff on the cloud, and they're going to be in a hybrid cloud environment. And that makes total sense when you think of all the different types of data that you have to access, whether it's from data services on, prescription data or customer data for healthcare providers, cloud-based CRMs, content management. All these things need to be accessible to some extent in the same environment. And that really requires a cloud strategy, like I said, to set up the plumbing for this.
Great. Maria, what's your perspective? What should leaders focus on as they get started in their change journey?
Yeah, so one thing that I wanted to maybe reframe is that I don't think that anybody is starting, right? I think people have been investing, companies have been investing in this for quite some time. And so people have sales systems and marketing systems and various channels, various promotions, analytics, of course, right? Different platforms, cloud initiatives. I think that what's difficult is to kind of get from these pieces. If you imagine this kind of puzzle, little pieces laying on the floor, how do we get it to the coherent picture, the seamless picture? And how do we identify what's missing, right? And so it's the scaling it up, scaling it to the whole organization, making it more seamless for the customers and pervasive in the organization, from franchise to franchise, from country to country. That's the challenge that I think, seeing a lot in the companies. And so how do we start it? I maybe will talk about one company who has done it, and I feel that they're very successful. It starts with cross-functional senior leadership vision, right? Just vision of what we're doing today and what do we want to do tomorrow. And sometimes you just put, one customer experience in front of the people and they gasp, right? Because that's not what we want. It's too much, it's too fragmented, it's all over the place, all of our teams doing something different. So that's not what we want. But what do they want? And that company looked at that and made a few leadership workshops to figure out what is the experience that they really want and what is that it should look like from all the different perspectives, from the sales perspective, from the marketing perspective, from analytics perspective. And from that point, what do we already have? Which pieces of this puzzle we already have, and which ones we need to build or create or buy potentially, right? And how do we really fill those gaps? And creating an organizational program around this. In the gaps, some of it are systems, but some of it sometimes are skills, right? So it may be that you don't have enough data science skills, or it may be that you don't have the right organization leading the change, and it sits somewhere in the silo, and maybe it's kind of not empowered to drive the large-scale organizational. Or some companies have this innovation office that doesn't have authority or maybe even budget, and it has to go and ask for this budget for different franchises, and then it may not start. So what gaps are may be very different from company to company, but in that particular case, the company recognized that it wasn't using this consistently. There were some pieces of infrastructure that they were missing. There were some data science skills they were missing. So they went and created a roadmap to fill that gap. And one other thing that they realized that they needed was this data-driven mindset, right? How do we measure what we're doing and figure out if it's not enough or too much, and tweak it and pivot and continue to continuously improve over time. So I think that journey that they are on and the kind of the focus, the laser focus on the journey that they wanted to achieve, the organization across all the different silos that brought them all together, I think that was very successful, and they're one of the front runners. You know, the different companies may be a different part of this journey, but I would imagine that that's the same sequence of steps would maybe help. One more piece that I wanted to double down on what JF said, that you shouldn't be perfectionist, right? This is not a perfection game. This is a let's do something, let's get somewhere, let's measure, let's see what we're lacking, and let's make the next step. And those companies who are spending time in planning and kind of these big planning efforts, or strategy projects, but not start investing and kind of taking steps, they sometimes fall behind, because there is no such thing as perfection, and there is no such thing that as you can predict what's going to happen when you start experimenting. So this data-driven mindset, experimentation mindset, not letting perfection be the enemy of the good, that's another piece that maybe some steps that people need to take.
Jeff, what about you from an ops perspective? What do you think organizations should focus on? What should they prioritize?
I would think the first step would be really to recognize that things are changing, that there is a new model, there's a need for a new model, and some of the things that we've done in the past may not be applicable anymore. So Pratap talked earlier about the fact that some of the new roles are becoming less and less demand generation focused. So we have many roles now that are not 100% generation focused, and therefore you need to support them operationally from a different perspective. So the first step then is recognizing that the change is there. One good way to do that is to pause, really assess your system and process overall across commercial ops, across the entire commercial ops organization, and then trying to understand what is changing, aligning on the change, and then adapting your solution. So that would be your first steps. Then from that one, once you do that and recognize that, you may need to find new way to track or new metric or new KPI to bring as part of your commercial organization. And those might be, some of those KPI might be much more leading type of indicator versus the lagging type of indicator that we had in the past. So in the past, we had very precise indicators like prescriptions and sales and so on. Now we're looking at, with those roles are becoming less demand generation focused, you need to think of more qualitative KPIs. You may want to think about customer experience. You may want to think about I would say the service feedback or different things like that are a little more qualitative that would need to be incorporated into your organization. And then one big change there will be for the commercial ops organization to be comfortable with those new metrics that we haven't really tracked in the past, that are not as accurate as in the past, and really starting with some of those metrics now, so that we have good indicators, and we have to be comfortable that it's not perfect, as Maria mentioned earlier. And then the last one is from a process perspective. Companies have been investing a lot in platform and processes over the past few years. There is a need to really step up the game there and be at the top, to have really good platform, fully integrated, so that you can adopt the change, but then also being able to become nimble, like we say, and to be able to incorporate that as part of your operational support.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, having the right technology is critical. To finish up, I'd like to hear from all of you what your thoughts are on the magnitude of the change that we will see and the speed at which it's going to happen, at which you feel it's going to happen. We've seen some movement, but is this movement temporary, or will we see lasting, durable change? So the question that I'm going to ask, and I'm going to ask all of you to answer this question, is very simply, where do you see pharma in 5 years in regards to changing its commercial model and infrastructure? Michael, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, first, to give a little perspective on that question, which is a great question. I think if you had asked us 1 year ago where we'd be today, never mind 5 years ago, we all would have been wrong. Because, obviously we've had, perhaps it's a, once in a century pandemic that kind of interrupted all our plans, and actually in terms of technical change, accelerated a lot of things. So, but I think clearly, whether you say in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, there's going to be a lot more data. There's going to be a lot more emphasis on digital channels. And I don't mean just, ways of reaching healthcare providers, but if you think of the proliferation of, apps that healthcare consumers use, or digital therapeutics, wearables, things like that, there's data coming. There's going to be data coming from everywhere, and what we really need to be focused on is, harnessing the technology that's going to be able to sort through this just gigantic amounts of data and come up with insights and give us the tools we need to decide what we should do next, and how we can be more effective and how we can be more productive. And I think another big change that's coming is, again, in the topic of data, things like real-world data, real-world evidence, which are primarily being used in the R&D and clinical side of things right now. I think you're going to see that seeping over to the commercial side and being used for things like outcome-based pricing or value-based pricing for drugs, for medical devices. It's going to be affecting things like market access, and I think that's going to be really valuable. If you think of all the new sources of data that weren't even around 10 years ago, like I said, wearables, patient apps, therapeutics, et cetera, we are going to figure out how to harness that data and to tailor medicine better, and to be able to communicate more effectively in terms of providing valuable data and insights to providers as well as to patients. So I think it's all about the data and the digital channels. That is, that train has left the station. It's not going back, and it's just going to go faster and faster. And we need to deal with it, with the technology that is there to help us, whether it's analytics, AI, like I said, platforms and infrastructure. It's going to be a lot more data, and I think we're going to be the better for it.
Great. Maria, what do you think? Where do you see pharma in 5 years?
I want to double down on data and digital, a lot of it. And I think that if we think about how much data is going to come and how much of it we can use, and how fast we will need to process it. What I imagine the pharma will need to develop in 5 years to be able to drive this commercial model is like a big brain, right? The big brain that is constantly ready to accept all this data coming from all over the place and internally, right? Process it very fast, figure out what needs to be done, figure out if it's some, digital outreach to a customer, if it's personal, which rep, in which team, is it, do you need to pull through from administrators to the HCPs and the accounts? So all of this time together, it's going to be a lot of data and a lot of analytics going very fast, right? So then the question is, how do we build that? What are the platforms? What are the analytics? What are the skills that allow us to build that big brain that will drive all of our commercial activity 5 years from now? And I think that's the challenge that we will see people starting to solve.
Thanks, Maria. Pratap, beyond the big brain, how about you? Where do you see pharma in 5 years?
So Tom, great question. I'll approach it from the outside-in perspective. All will be big. They'll be very important, like Maria and Michael said. What about the customer? So right now, pharma looks at its customer base and says, physicians 200,000, ballpark, that they worry about, that they sell to. But 5 years from now, they're going to have to worry about this thing called the pie of power. 3 constituents, not just the 200,000 physicians, but the 200 million or so patients as consumers. Again, depends on your therapy area. And on the flip side, not 200,000, but only 200 really large, really important entities, organized customers like payers and providers. So the 200 and the 200,000 and the 200 million all will become important. And depending on your therapy area, it could be 40% the first, 40% the second, 20% the third, or some other ratio. But I think pharma will have to get much better at selling to all 3 types of constituents using all those capabilities Maria and Michael talked about. And right now, if I look at the companies, I would say the top quartile of companies, the top 20, 25%, are really heading down this path. They're realizing the change. They're realizing the 3 types of stakeholders. They're realizing the importance of these internal capabilities around digital and data. And they will open up a competitive moat, which is probably about a 2 to 3 year lead time, because what we're seeing is making this change takes time, and for it to scale within the company takes time. So if you start now, you have a 3-year advantage, especially if you move very quickly with the agility that was also talked about. And 5 years from now, I suspect there will be a broader spectrum of the top quartile of companies much farther along, and the others sort of struggling to catch up a little bit.
You definitely want to end up in the top quartile. GF, last but not least, yourself, what's your perspective? Where do you see pharma in 5 years in respect to the changes to their commercial model?
So Tom, from an operational perspective, I would see really 2 main trends. One is the use of brand new information that either we're not aware of today, but that will be new information that we'll be able to leverage 5 years from now, or information that we have today, but we cannot leverage in the right way, just because it's too costly or it takes too much time to use it. So that would be one of the first trend that I see. And then the second one, from an operation perspective, is the notion of an event or trigger or POA would somewhat disappear, or the notion of change to some extent disappear, because the operational process and the system will be able to manage and navigate through change seamlessly. Things will be on, information will be available at any point in time, insight will be available, new information will be there. There wouldn't be a need to try to organize a whole organization to make a change per se. It will just become natural.
Thanks, JF. And as we wrap this up, I'd really like to thank you all the panelists. This has been a very informative and very inspiring talk. I think a couple of very strong themes have emerged as I look to what you all have said. First, there seems to be this convergence of digital acceleration and the COVID shock to the healthcare system, let's call it that way. And this convergence is creating the conditions for real change. It's creating the conditions for more change, perhaps, than we've probably seen in the past 20 to 30 years. I think second, there's a number of key obvious areas pharma should consider. As Pratap described in his 4-vector framework, from a model that is more local, more flexible, to an increased focus on B2B, to the investment in new platforms and technology with a strong emphasis on digital. I think there's a number of very strong options to be considered at this point in time. But we've also seen that there's some very strong barriers and organizational challenges that come in the way of initiating this change. And in order to overcome these obstacles, sometimes it comes down to courage and to leadership. And I think a number of participants have described and shared a number of examples of leaders, making the leap, and leaders at all levels, making the leap and making a difference for their organization. So once again, thank you all, panelists. And now I will hand it back to Laura to see if there's additional questions for the panelists.
Well, fascinating, and thank you so much to our panel today. We do have a few minutes left to field some questions. A reminder, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A widget on the left-hand side of your screen. So we're going to jump into a couple of questions here. First question here, what are infrastructure changes needed to support a new commercial model? Who would like to take that one on?
JF, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. So from an infrastructure perspective, clearly we talked about the technology platform. You need to have something that is fully integrated across your whole commercial organization to support your new model, and integrate it upstream and downstream. So that's really the one foundational step there. The second one is also trying to mirror that integration within the organization itself. So we cannot continue to work in silo, where you have different group and department passing the ball one by one. That takes too much time. So we basically need to organize ourselves to be able to become agile and be able to become nimble, so that we can react and implement the change.
Great. Thank you for taking that question on there. You've talked about the importance of leadership throughout the organization. Does leadership need to come from the bosses, or can it happen at all levels?
Well, I think it has to happen at all levels. And, you know, there's different types of leadership. I mean, obviously the senior leadership are the ones who, you know, control the resources. They're the ones that are able to affect change in terms of, getting strategies approved by whether it's the board or whether it's their own senior leadership. But, you know, leadership, when we spoke earlier about this, I alluded to leadership at different levels. And really, the leaders need to be looking down into their organizations and having people that they can rely on who are, you know, in touch with the folks using the systems. Good ideas come from every level. So it's, throughout the organization, having the ability to speak up and point out that there may be a problem trying to execute something on whatever technology is being provided, or that it's just not accomplishing what they had hoped. And, you know, of course, that's best presented as, hey, I have a better idea on this. So that's a different kind of leadership that's just as crucial. And again, to be able to go down to the actual level of the people, you know, using, whether it's the CRM, the analytics software, the orchestration or orchestration engine. The folks using that really need to, you know, have leaders in their midst that are prepared to speak up and suggest a better way to do things. So yes, I totally agree that it's important to have leadership throughout the organization, and it takes different forms.
Great. Thank you so much for tackling that question. And that's all the time we have today. A big thanks to our speakers and, of course, our audience for joining us.